Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session, or one of the final sessions of LERA. We made it through the first virtual LERA conference, which I think has gone great. Today we're going to be talking about workforce development, which is a topic I'm extremely interested in and I think is very relevant during these times. This is section 15.1, best paper session in workforce development. We have Yujeong, Amanda Chuan, Kevin Lee, and Claire McKenna. And I'll first introduce Yujeong Yang. She is an assistant professor at the State University of New York, Cortland. She obtained her PhD in political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her research focuses on labor politics and welfare politics in China. She is especially interested in how an authoritarian state manages labor in the era of labor informalization and automation. Her articles have been published in China Quarterly, Public Administration and Development, Law and Society Inquiry, and Politics and Society. So the idea of, Yujeong is going to go first. This was intended to be an asynchronous session. Hopefully you have watched some of the presentations beforehand, or all of them. If you haven't, we're going to have people just go over briefly for 5 or so minutes. At least you can contribute to the discussion, and we want it to kind of be an open forum where people can participate. So Yujeong, if you want to take it away, you can share your screen, feel free.
Oh, I don't have any screen to share. I have already posted my slides and video clip online. So I'm gonna just briefly introduce what I have actually discussed in my presentation and paper. So the title of my paper is Vocational Education and Training in the Era of Labor Automation in China. So in my paper, I was exploring the question of how do robots and AI technologies affect the vocational training system development in developing countries. And I explored this question focusing on China because China is the country that has this fastest development in the AI technologies and robotics technology in the workplaces. And I focus on the regional variation in the vocational training systems in China. And I found that Chinese localities that have the most exposure to AI development and robotization experience a more rapid expansion or extensive expansion of the vocational education and training, evidenced by the increase of the teacher to student ratio in each vocational training institutions. However, what I found more interesting was the fact that the type of vocational training systems that develop in response to AI adoption or robotization differs across localities characterized by different economic systems or economic structures. That is, in localities that are dominated by large-sized firms, AI adoption do contribute to the expansion of vocational training, but they mostly develop the vocational high schools, which focuses on general skill development of students as well as specific skill development. In localities that are dominated by small-sized firms, on the other hand, AI adoption do facilitate or elicit vocational training development. But in this case, the AI adoption elicits the development of private vocational training agencies, which mainly focuses on specific skill development for adult workers. So in my paper, I explored how the effect of AI adoption on the development of vocational training system differs and how they interact with local economic structure. I look forward to receiving a lot of questions and feedback on my paper.
Great, thank you. So now we have Amanda Chuan, who is an assistant professor at Michigan State University's School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. She received her PhD from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania in 2018. Her research focuses on labor and behavioral economics. Within labor and economics, she studies human capital investment decisions and how they contribute to gender and socioeconomic inequality within labor markets. Within behavioral economics, she uses a variety of experimental methods to explore pro-social behavior and team dynamics between individuals. Sorry, that was my dog. I apologize. Please take it away, Amanda.
Let me unmute myself first, and I'm going to try to share screen. I might be sharing the wrong screen. 1 second. Okay. So can everyone see my slides? Awesome. So this paper is called Skills for the Future, a life cycle approach to systems of vocational education and training. This is joint with Christian Ibsen, who's also at Michigan State University. So the idea behind this paper is there's this disemployment effect to vocational education. Prior work has documented that while vocational graduates tend to do quite well when they're young, they have higher employment rates, higher earnings than people who go through the traditional system among 24-year-olds. As they age, they tend to do worse. So this employment gain reverses into this loss. And it's been this question as to why this happens. And prior work has mostly been in the form of conjecture that maybe those who gain vocational training are the ones who lack the skills to learn as they go and adapt to changing employer demands. And that's even more important in this day and age when automation, technological development in general is rapidly changing the skills that are demanded. So what we do in this paper is we exploit differences across vocational regimes. So there's been work which shows that in regimes that focus more on specific training, so vocational schools that are really apprenticeship based, involve a lot of employer inputs, workers tend to do worse. This disemployment effect is magnified. Whereas, and we call these collectivist regimes in our paper. We focus on collectivist regimes who tend to have this apprenticeship-based system for vocational training. And we contrast this with status systems where vocational training is still very school-based. A lot of classes are taken with general education students in the same schools in status vocational systems, whereas in collectivist vocational systems, you're in separate schools and you spend a lot of your time outside of the classroom at work. So we ask whether or not this difference in the disemployment effect across vocational training regimes could be due to the difference in skill provision, general versus specific. And in particular, we try to validate the hypothesis of prior work, which says there's a skill story here. So what we do is we use the PIAC data, the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. So this allows us to do cross-country comparisons. There's a lot of countries in this data, and for each country, it's supposed to be nationally representative of the workforce. So, and it's also got really rich variables regarding job characteristics, tasks, and skills. And the methodology we use is a modification of the Hanushek et al. Differences in differences specification. So we use a triple difference specification where we're regressing our outcome on the worker's age, whether or not they're vocational or general education trained, and whether they belong in a statist or a collectivist country, and the interactions therein. And the coefficient of interest here, because we care about what happens as workers get older, is this triple interaction coefficient. So that's what we focus on for this talk. So we can talk about identification and the assumptions under which we require, the assumptions that we require for causal inference, but happy to discuss that during Q&A. I'm just gonna show you the results real quick. So these are the predicted trajectory of, in this case, employment by age profile for different types of workers. So by vocational versus general education and by status versus collectivist regime. And what you see is that there's this trend that's unlike the others. There's this blue solid marker, which shows there's this steeper drop off in the employment of workers who are vocational in collectivist countries. And this difference is significantly different than that of vocational workers in status countries. So to delve into why this might happen, we look at outcomes. So we explore whether or not workers have this difference in learning ability on the job. That's these first two panels, and we find that collectivist vocational workers have this steeper drop-off in readiness to learn and on-the-job training opportunities compared to their counterparts in status regimes, and also compared to general education workers, which are the hollow markers. We also find lower computer use at work as workers age among collectivist vocational workers. We also try to look at different types of skill profiles. So we in particular focus on social skills. And the reason we focus on social skills is because of this growing literature which talks about the importance of social skills in helping people retain their employment. So if you are highly social, then you are able to learn skills from your coworkers. You're also better at team-based production, and more production these days are in the firm is team-based. So we find lower use of influencing skills, which is social, and planning skills, which involves coordinating with others among collectivist vocational workers. And again, this is significantly different from how vocational workers in status regimes fare. So this all points to this idea that across a variety of outcomes, those in vocational systems that are more specific skill-based tend to fare worse as they age than those in vocational systems that are more general skills-based. We also run other measures for firm-specific versus general skills that allow us to not rely on the collectivist versus statist designation. So this allows us also to use more countries from the sample in the PIAC data. So we're able to look at employer involvement and vocational specificity, which are both measures of how specific the skills training is. And we find our results replicate across the outcomes that we care about. So overall, the contributions of our paper are: first, we provide evidence to substantiate the pathways by which this disemployment effect can occur, and therefore, provide a fuller picture as to why this disemployment effect happens. And second, in doing so, we provide ways in which you might want to think about improving vocational education, given that skill demands are changing all the time, but also that vocational education is becoming increasingly a valuable alternative to traditional forms of education like college, which is becoming quite expensive and not necessarily accessible to all. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Amanda, great. So now we have Kevin Lee, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. He is broadly interested in the role of state-society relations in equitable economic development. He explores this through two parallel research agendas. One is local workforce development planning in California for populations facing multiple compounded barriers to employment, especially that of undocumented immigrants in the informal economy. And two, the role of transnational advocacy networks in shaping the mobility of indigenous economic development policies and programs across the geopolitical region of Micronesia. So take it away, Kevin.
Thank you so much, and apologies for that long introduction. So I'll get right into it and try to stay on time. But so this is the name of my project, Structure the Age of Nonprofit Marketization. It's a case study of workforce development nonprofits in LA. All right. I'll spend the bulk of my short time on the theoretical setup just because the study is primarily a theory building project, and I'm happy to speak more about the empirics later on. So in the political science literature on nonprofit service providers, creaming is a central mechanism for understanding how disadvantaged populations are excluded from the work of nonprofit service providers. And drawing from rational choice theory, the old creaming thesis is this one. Public performance metrics provide incentives for individual nonprofits to maximize their efficiency in serving clients. And among workforce development scholars and practitioners, this has been and continues to be the standard model for conceiving exclusion from workforce development nonprofits, which are deputized by state and local governments to deliver publicly funded workforce development services. And in workforce development, disadvantaged clients facing compounded barriers to employment, such as the formerly incarcerated, the undocumented, the homeless, population struggling with substance abuse or mental illness, they do take up more time and resources to serve. And the idea is that individual nonprofits make the rational decision to not serve these disadvantaged clients, and that they're therefore excluded or creamed from the workforce development system. And this rational choice theory of nonprofit exclusion continues to persist so strongly over time, but we generally don't think of nonprofits as discrete rational actors weighing costs and benefits and making decisions in a vacuum. We think of them as deeply networked organizations. Rhetorically, we speak of workforce development nonprofits as labor market intermediaries, organizations that connect clients to the right kinds of employers, a function that is, of course, particularly important in our current context of a disaggregated labor market. Critically, the insights of neo-institutionalism and their influence, we think of organizations as working within informal and formal norms that then dictate how they act, and their decisions depend greatly on the relationships that they have with whom, of what character, in what environment, etc. And so in function between our rational choice conception of exclusion in the nonprofit sector and our network's conception of workforce development nonprofits, I thus pursued this research question: what role does provider networks play in the exclusion of the most disadvantaged from local workforce development systems? And I did this through, as I mentioned earlier, a qualitative study of workforce development nonprofits in LA. And workforce nonprofits in general can be divided into two main categories: federally workforce development providers, American Job Centers, AJCs, which are overwhelmingly dependent on Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA funding from the government, and non-AJC workforce development providers that do not receive WIOA funding, get state and local funds, and get a bunch of diverse streams of private funding as well from a range of different sources. In this project, I interviewed both AJCs and non-AJCs. AJCs serve specific geographical areas within their jurisdictions within the city. And these jurisdictions are called workforce development service areas. I sampled AJCs from all but one small service area and obtained a maximum variation sample of non-AJCs by organizational size and client type across city. So for a total of 27 interviews with 19 different providers. I also reviewed some local workforce development planning and policy documents to understand the policy context, and got a bunch of grant contracts as well from the providers to understand their local, state and local funding requirements and performance metrics. And so my main argument is this: that under conditions of public austerity and nonprofit marketization, workforce development nonprofits navigate intensified structural features of workforce development systems, including performance metrics, overhead funding provisions, funding cuts, paperwork requirements. And these all exclude marginalized populations through the additional mechanism of structural creaming. And by public austerity, I mean budget cuts, heightened expectations for nonprofit performance. By nonprofit marketization, I mean how public agencies systematically under-resource nonprofits for their services, promote inter-provider market competition through outcome-based performance metrics and incentives, and how they incentivize for-profit pursuits of commercial revenue generation to address nonprofit budget shortfalls. And under these two conditions, structural therefore occurs when workforce development providers fail to reach marginalized populations and appropriate employers, or to connect the two. This happens when there is limited capacity and incentive to reach out to support marginalized populations, and when fraught inter-provider collaborations prevent providers from addressing their network gaps. And structural creaming is not intended to replace creaming, which is an important mechanism. Rather, it captures an additional mechanism through which disadvantaged populations are excluded from the workforce development system. Under WIOA, some disadvantaged clients are classified as special populations, and the focus has been particularly on the homeless, the formerly incarcerated. AJCs are not formally assessed based on the numbers of special population clients they serve, but there is a shared informal expectation that they will, especially within LA. All right, so in terms of the big findings, I found that AJCs differ really widely in their ability to reach special populations, in their ability to connect them with those willing to hire them. And this is not really explained by place-based variation in clients and employers as well, because non-AJC providers in the same areas did not have the same issues. And this suggests that, again, it's a problem of networks. And indeed, AJCs, unlike their non-AJC counterparts, almost uniformly did not have any kind of systematic or informed protocol to reach different kinds of clients or employers. Outreach for both were largely based on geographical accident and city agency referrals. And this, in turn, is in large part because nonprofits are capacity strapped by processes of marketization and austerity, which I observed deeply in LA in a couple different ways that I won't do here. And then the question then becomes, all right, so individual nonprofits are capacity strapped. Why don't they just reach out to other AJCs that may have those connections? Why don't they reach out to non-AJCs that target specialized populations? Well, that leads us to how there are fraught politics of collaboration between AJCs with tightening budgets and limited resources, absent government support to help AJCs collaborate meaningfully with each other. AJCs then compete with each other for funding, for clients, stay firmly of their own service areas, and they really don't work with each other. This is a quote, something similar. While non-AJCs have much to offer AJCs, again, as providers that explicitly target special populations, the undocumented, formerly incarcerated, the homeless, the relationship between AJCs and non-AJCs is again very fraught. Absent government support, incentive, and ideological overlap for these kinds of organizations to work together as well. And that brings us my main argument, that under conditions of public austerity and nonprofit marketization, disadvantaged clients are excluded from local workforce development systems through structural creaming. And very quickly, I think or hope that this contributes to the workforce development scholarship in a couple ways. I think first, it proposes an additional mechanism through which disadvantaged are. If we care about equity, probably care about structural creaming. Second, while state and local governments are rushing to add new quantitative outcome metrics accountable, this suggests that alternative forms of accountability are important in an attempt to resist marketization trends and its consequences, some of which have been documented here. Process measures instead of quantitative outcome-based measures are a good starting point, network measures starting point. Finally, a lot of the scholarship on public development systems has mainly focused on WIOA, on AJCs, and this project suggests that maybe it's also important to consider the growing number of non-AJC providers that also constitute local workforce development systems and that are sustained by substantial state and local funding streams. Harnessed and invested in appropriately, perhaps non-AJCs can then play a critical role in addressing some of the network gaps within the funded workforce development system. All right, that a very fast presentation, but thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Kevin. And I want to say to the participants, if anyone has any questions as the presenters are giving their talks, please feel free to type them in the message board here and we can address them after everyone's done. Next, we have Claire McKenna, who is a doctoral student with the Institute for Work and Employment Research at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She's interested in organizational practices that influence the skills and careers of workers. Prior to joining MIT, Claire worked at the National Employment Law Project, which is a US labor rights organization where she researched government policies that help the unemployed. Claire earned her master's degree in public administration from New York University's Wagner School. So take it away, Claire.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. Just to clarify, the work featured in my presentation reflects fieldwork conducted over 2018 and 2019. And the question at the center of my paper is what accounts for the low adoption of high-performance work systems in the US. So the general consensus seems to be that following an expansion in the early 1990s, high-performance practices never reached more than a large minority of US firms. And so explanations tend to cite operational barriers to adoption, but in my paper, I explore an alternative, largely political explanation. And this is based on an appreciation of the fact that high-performance practices commonly involve changes to an organization's division of labor. And these changes potentially affect the work of multiple groups of people, and how groups interpret and respond will depend on factors like their position in the organization, their division, their occupation, as well as the context in which change is introduced. And so I pursue this line of reasoning through qualitative study of two, what is largely understood to be underused work reforms at a US automaker called Autoco. Specifically, I look at interpretations of the two practices by representatives from multiple relevant entities. So these include departments in the company with involvement in work organization decisions, the National Labor Union, and workers in a plant where there seemed to be meaningful variation in use of the two practices. So both, and I speak with both union and non-union workers. And so I explore how interpretations of the work reforms vary across groups within AutoCo, with the goal of helping to explain forces that limit their broader adoption. And just quickly, as far as the reforms, they apply to AutoCo's core unionized workforce. So the first reform allows certain skilled trades employees to perform across job boundaries as members of self-managed teams called maintenance teams. And the second reform delegates certain lower level maintenance tasks from skilled trades to production employees through a practice called production minor maintenance. So the paper focuses in particular on the ways different sources of insecurity underpin and inform reported perceptions of the two practices, and uses the concepts of opportunity and threat to characterize actor accounts of the change. So I'll highlight just a few of the key findings, and then I'll share kind of brief reflections on contribution. So the two work reforms were largely perceived as threats by those having to share work to which they had some degree of exclusive rights historically. So frontline managers, it was reported in the case of maintenance teams, and skilled trades employees in the case of minor maintenance. On the other hand, the reforms were largely perceived as opportunities by those groups with whom work was being shared. So skilled trades employees in the case of maintenance teams, and production operators in the case of production minor maintenance. And as to upper level management, facing high competition, a shifting business environment, and on the heels of a restructuring, they generally interpreted the two work practices as opportunities to enhance plant productivity and cut equipment downtime. And some employees also described the delegation of work from skilled to production employees through production minor maintenance as part of a general upward transition in workforce skills, and one really necessitated by what they viewed as accelerating technological change. And so they needed, it was explained, skilled trades employees to be engaged in more complex work. And really a similar view was expressed by non-skilled national union representatives. So with production workers facing relatively few mobility opportunities, they embraced the opportunity to broaden their work responsibilities and the responsibilities of a segment of the workforce which constitutes, the majority of the union. But skilled trades representatives, they actually really cast doubt on sort of these company sort of declarations, and while they were on the whole more supportive of maintenance teams, kind of absent what they viewed as offsetting skill building investments on behalf of the skilled trades, they viewed company efforts to delegate outward some of their work with suspicion, and thus tended to resist them. And so as to this work's contributions, first by showing variation in interpretations of the work reforms across important interest groups at AutoCo, this study contributes some insight into group responses to workplace change and to factors that may impede broader adoption. And this kind of builds on some early work by Rosemary Bott, for instance, and others that kind of looks at, sort of tries to apply a political lens to workplace change, responses to change, and focuses on sort of contexts in which change is introduced. I think in particular, the paper uncovers some interesting variation in entities that the literature tends to treat as homogenous. So among management, for instance, there were really salient differences between upper management and plant management. Especially it was clear from my fieldwork that lower level sort of frontline supervisors were especially squeezed and subject to downsizing gradually. And then of course there were key differences across the union, sort of between what seemed like skilled versus non-skilled. And so with respect to the union, I mean, in spite of obviously a shared interest in strengthening member job security and in what they understood to be a fragile economic environment, as I said, the findings show meaningful divisions nationally from those, between those in the skilled trades and those not. And I think too, just finally, this study suggests that high performance practices can be a source of upheaval for groups, for some groups with especially strong occupational culture or identity. And so in the case of the skilled trades, they're an historically powerful group in the union, but these disruptions to divisions of labor seem to coincide with other emerging sources of uncertainty for this group and weakness in factors that have historically entitled them to special representation and treatment. And prior literature has focused or considered how insecure contexts derived from poor economic performance affect responses to flexible work reforms. But in this paper, I try to sort of consider kind of insecurity derived from declines in occupational status. So that concludes my remarks, and I'm happy and looking forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Great, awesome, thank you, Claire. So I want to give a round of applause to everyone who presented today. That was great. Thank you for that. And I also want to say before we open it up to discussion, we have, as this session was asynchronous, all of these presentations are posted on the discussion page, which I'm assuming will be left up after LERA. So if you want more detailed presentations, they had longer presentations our presenters did on the discussion forum, and they're all available there with some questions. So please continue this discussion on. But for now, we can open it up. I know we already had a question here. I think it was to Barbara. Was this to Kevin or Amanda? And I can read it off, but if you'd like to just hop in and ask it yourself, feel free.
Hey, can you hear me? I don't know if
yes, can hear you.
Okay, great. Yes. Yeah, I was just wondering about, Kevin, this study of nonprofits, the accountability measures that you're talking about that you call marketization, and with the suggestion that they move more toward process measures. The accountability measures that we're experiencing now are as a result of a long history of process measures that actually didn't work. That is, process was used as a proxy for impact, and nobody really knew whether there was impact. So there's got to be some happy medium, as opposed to sort of, and then the question I also had was, if you look longitudinally before all of this, what you call marketization emerged, were these organizations better at the problem that you are describing, which is reaching these very difficult to reach, harder to serve populations, as opposed to, did they do less creaming before these accountability measures were in place? And if so, then that maybe suggests that your hypothesis is right, but if not, then it's not necessarily these marketization measures that are the reason that creaming exists. So I just wanted to push that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful, thoughtful question. Your question had a couple different parts. I'll try to take on a couple of them. So one, I absolutely think that outcome measures still matter. I think that it's important to understand the impact of these different organizations, particularly the non-AJC providers. I'm thinking about, Center for Employment Opportunity, and a lot of hype that has been around the intersection of reentry services and workforce development, and how in so many cases we still don't know what are the long-term social impacts, labor market impacts, and what are the mechanisms that lead to those positive or negative outcomes, how these programs work. And so I still think that outcome measures matter. I think that in local workforce development systems, the tendency has been to just focus on outcomes and to not focus enough on, one, providing organizations with the funding and capacity to make those outcomes happen, particularly for disadvantaged clients. And two, I think that it's not the only kind of strategy to keep nonprofits accountable, particularly during this stage when we still don't know so much about, how CEO works, how non-AJCs work. So I guess that's one point. So I agree with you that there should be a happy medium for sure, and that outcome measures matter. I think the second question, this study is not a longitudinal study. How wonderful that it would be if I did have longitudinal data on these nonprofits, from CEDA down to WIA and then WIOA in 2014. That would have been lovely. And my study doesn't offer that, but what it does do is that it compares AJCs and non-AJCs are receiving very different kinds of funding streams, subject to very different kinds of performance pressures, and how non-AJCs manage to reach marginalized populations while operating in the same area. They manage to reach employers that are monolingual immigrants, willing to hire formerly incarcerated populations and willing to hire homeless populations in the same area, that and so that if we care about changing the way that AJCs work, if we care about making their accessible to more disadvantaged populations, then we should care about changing the kinds of that we subject them to, that they can better connect with disadvantaged clients and employers that will serve them.
That's great. Thank you. Really appreciate your answer. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful question.
Amanda, did you want to ask Yujeong the question yourself, or I can read it off? It's up to you.
I can ask. So actually, I'd like to ask the second question first. This question is, I guess, two questions really. So in your presentation, Yujeong, you showed a lot of geographical heterogeneity in terms of the types of vocational institutions that are there. And I'm wondering what could have led this to happen. Like, was this due to differences in industry? Were there kind of historical reasons why certain areas were, you know, skill-based vocational programs and others were knowledge-based? So that's the first question. The second is, how are we to think about worker sorting into these different types of vocational programs? Is it just purely due to access, where like in your area you only have one and so you choose to go to that? Or you know, what's the extent to which they can choose between these two types?
Thank you so much for a great question. Can I share my screen if I want to? Okay. So about the first question, I don't need the slides for the geographical distribution of the VET system. I think, particularly in my paper, I focused on the industrial distribution and the size of firms that differs across localities in China. I mean, there can be many, many different locale factors that will explain the reason why each locality has developed one type of vocational training system more extensively than the other types. But as you said, the industrial distribution of each locality differs hugely in different across different localities or provinces in China. So, for example, in certain localities in China, in provinces in China, they are mostly most of their employment is for the service sector, like most of them are employed in the wholesale and retail. And these are the kind of the industries that are really easily automated and affected by AI adoption. Other localities, they do have this kind of service and wholesale and retail, but at the same time, many of their employment in their localities are science and technology or computer development. And these are the sectors that are not easily automated, or they can be, or where the workers can be replaced by the AI adoption. So I thought that this different industrial distribution would definitely affect the type of vocational training that will be needed by workers. So the measure that I chose to measure the level of exposure to AI adoption was by looking at the number of workers employed in each different sectors of industry. I divided by 19 industries. And then there's this kind of previous literature that kind of estimated the percentage of workers that will be exposed and displaced by AI adoption in 2094. And they also divided that by 19 categories. So you cross-use them to calculate the workers' exposure to AI adoption. So definitely this industrial distribution across locality would affect the different types of vocational training system that will develop in each locality. For your second question, which is about the sorting system, I haven't actually identified one province as either skill-based or knowledge-based. It could be both. But the fact that I actually focused on was the fact that some localities focus more on when they are developing their vocational system. Can you see the screen here? Yeah. When they are developing their vocational training system, in some localities, they focus on high schools, it's not that they do not have the private vocational training agencies, which mainly focus on skill transformation, that focuses on adult workers, and it lasted for like 3 months terms. So it's really a skill that can be used immediately by adult workers, whereas vocational high schools, they focus on skills at the however, they also focus on general education as well. And you can see that the school to teacher, the teacher to student ratio differs widely across localities. Some localities, they focus both on the high school and training agencies. But we know that the geographical distribution of this kind of teacher to student ratio of the two VT institutions differ widely. So that's how I kind of sorted the two different types of vocational training systems.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
For Amanda, I mean, first of all, thank you to everyone for such wonderful and insightful presentations. I really loved the second of it. But for Amanda, I was wondering, you study is really insightful and says a lot about the supply side end of things and how workers change over time and their job characteristics, their computer work, their social skills. But I'm also wondering about the side of things. Employers are ageist, and I'm specifically.
Sorry, you cut out a little bit. You're also wondering about the employer side of things. Is that?
Yeah, the employer side of things, and that may be beyond the scope of this study, which is fantastic, like sort of supply side approach to things. But I was wondering if you could speak more to that. And I'm thinking about, some of the critical work literature around soft skills and when they matter, and like women in frontline positions, and soft skills are a penalty. And then when highly skilled men have them, they're a premium. And I'm also wondering if there's an analogous sort of dynamic happening for older workers without college degrees, or with just vocational certificates.
So you're right that the focus of the paper is supply side. We want to see kind of like how the ways in which we can get people to skill up such that they're not just good to go for when they're working at 24, but also when they're 55. In terms of the ageism, or just employer discrimination in general, that's why we focus on the differences in difference. So the idea is if you assume that people are equally ageist across regimes, right, then that should be differenced out by the triple difference specification. So the differences that we see in terms of how vocational workers fare between collectivist and statist regimes should, under that assumption, be the result of differences in their ability to kind of retain their job. To kind of your secondary point about soft skills, I think that's part of the reason why everyone in economics, at least, is so jazzed about these results regarding social skills, because that's kind of the best way to quantitatively capture these soft skills. It's stuff that we've been trying to get at for a really long time, and so far this is kind of a break. The idea behind social skills that's from the Deming 2017 paper, the Deming and Kahn 2016 paper, those are kind of breakthroughs in that they allow us to try to get at the value of soft skills. So this might be helping older workers retain their jobs if you believe that general skills and a school-based education where you're talking to a lot of other people as opposed to you're just training on technical skills at your apprenticeship. If you believe that helps you kind of understand other people, communicate better, develop better soft skills such that you can learn more skills in the future and be a better team player. We're going to be hand wavy on that because we don't have the data to really delve into that super deeply, but it is something that may be going on behind our social skills results. Thanks for your question.
I think it's a phenomenal study.
Thank you.
Great.
And I had a question for Amanda if we have any time.
Yeah, so we have 15 minutes. So
yeah, okay. So it's a really interesting work. What the typical story about the vocationally oriented countries doing a better job with labor force attachment early on in careers, and then the kind of statist collectivist country kind of doing a better job with general education that kind of makes you more adaptable over time. At some level, in your graphs, the statist or collective seem to be doing better. I mean, from the very beginning, they, their kind of labor force attachment, even for 24-year-olds or 25-year-old, look like it was better. So the vocationally oriented, kind of apprenticeship-based countries didn't seem to, that traditional story didn't seem, it's kind of motivating your research, but it didn't seem to hold up in that those countries weren't doing much, better than the statist collectivist countries at those early ages. What do you make of that?
Okay, great question. First, you got me to go back and look at those results again, just to make sure. But so with the predicted models, with respect to skills, you don't necessarily see that collectivist vocational workers are doing better than statist workers. The reason is because we're starting at age 24. So vocational workers tend to start working at 16 to 18 or so. The reason we wanted to kind of cut that off is because we didn't want this mechanical effect of, you're 16, you're going to start working in Germany because you just finished your apprenticeship, versus you're 16, you're a traditional worker, you're going to go to college, right? That's a mechanical difference that isn't super interesting, right? So we wanted to kind of be as conservative as possible when estimating kind of our results over time. So we started everything at 24, but our results our results all hold and are stronger when we start at 18 too.
But by age 24, the any advantage of the vocational system has already gone away.
So exactly. So it does seem like a lot of this employment advantage, this better youth, school to work transition that people talk about is mechanical. But second, this paper is mostly concerned about what happens when people age. A lot of papers look at the school to work transition, right? Because they care about how do we get these youths into jobs. But in order for a job to be successful, we have to think about how do people retain their employment. Especially since, when you're unemployed when you're 55, that's more problematic potentially for society because you don't have that runway to skill up and build human capital in another occupation if you were to have to switch occupations. Whereas when you're young and you get unemployed, like you could potentially switch occupations and still do okay. So we were mostly concerned in this paper about looking at the older worker effects. But yeah, thank you for your questions. And I'm a big fan of your work.
Great. I actually have a question for Claire. So some research, I'm not surprised that you found kind of this negative relationship between, that unions perceived high performance work systems as a threat. I think other research has shown that relationship, but I think what is interesting about yours is that you show more about the nuance and the mechanism through which that threat effect occurs. So I'd love to hear more about that and more about the national unions' ambivalence of accepting high performance work systems and how that might have influenced or been different than the issues at the workplace level and those union representatives who might have either similarly taken the nationals' lead or maybe have different reasons for seeing high performance work systems as a threat. I assume there would be differences, and you see a lot of disconnect between local unions and national unions, but I was just wondering if maybe there was kind of an alignment here and where they both were like, no, we don't really want this.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, I do think as far as the skilled trades, I mean, they seemed to, and this was the case kind of nationally, and for the most part locally among union representatives, and especially actually among skilled workers who were participants in the maintenance teams, they seem to really on the whole embrace those structures because, they viewed them as opportunities for the skilled trades, whom they, view as kind of experts to kind of gain control of the work process. And so but although I will say there was some variation locally, among a local union representative I spoke with in kind of another area of this plant, he actually vehemently opposed, both practices within his bargaining unit, because he did see them essentially as company ruses to cut skilled employment. But in terms of the variation kind of in this plant, on the side of the plant where it seemed like there were fewer skilled employees, it was less automated, they were kind of a less self-sufficient bargaining unit in terms of skilled employment training, they had kind of let in these maintenance teams and seemed to kind of embrace them. So, but there was this, the other kind of representative was really sort of holding the line, against really any sort of changes to division of labor that affected skilled work. But I mean, where the skilled trades seemed to really draw the line, they were fine with kind of blurring job boundaries between them, but they really drew the line at kind of, practices that kind of allocated away their work to production operators. I'm trying to, what your second question was kind of getting at sort of differences by tier. I mean, it seemed to be.
So, and I guess a follow-up or kind of more clarifying question is, what was the union representing both skilled and unskilled workers?
The national, I mean, so I will say, I did not get, there are serious limitations to this study, and there are certain perspectives that I miss. And so in the plant, for instance, I really only had a chance to interview kind of skilled union representatives. So I didn't get a chance at the local level to talk with servicing representatives who kind of essentially represented the interests of production operators. But I will say, what I did notice, if you look at sort of contract language, there has been progress nationally in terms of changes to work organization and sort of introducing more flexible divisions of labor among skilled trades between skilled and production. But there's this kind of decoupling that happens where, in order to ratify a contract quickly, both the union and the company, will sort of engage in this kind of, allow this deviation process, where, locals can kind of continue with the status quo. And that seemed to be where kind of most of the resistance kind of came from. That, again, there was progress nationally, but, locally there was, because of this deviation process, because, national language provided locals with a lot of flexibility in terms of how they organize work. That's really where sort of adoption slowed, or the source of slow adoption. That kind of answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Amanda, go
very
ahead.
quickly, if I can ask Clara a question as well, because I just love the study so much, and I'm curious to know, what do you think are the scope conditions of this like political kind of theory of how or when or why high performance work systems are adopted, because I was also thinking about, how right now in our age, there's a lot of horizontal job mobility. We see the erosion of careers, we see like the erosion of workplace identity maybe, or at least like a reconfiguration of workplace and identity. And I'm wondering, like, do you think this is like a generational, like, like manufacturing sort of issue that will be eroded in the future, or how do you think this political conception of high performance work systems adoption will change going forward, particularly maybe in the service sector or among younger workers as they age, maybe?
That was a broad question. I appreciate the question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it, but I guess the way I'm kind of understanding part of your question, this is in a very traditional kind of unionized setting. So that kind of there's maybe a stronger sense, especially among the skilled trades, where there's kind of strong adherence to this apprenticeship model, kind of like a strong kind of occupational identity. And, is there that same kind of identity present in like the service sector, for example? And so would this kind of political framework work well there, I guess, is how I'm sort of understanding your question. And I guess that's kind of that's one I've kind of thought about, how does this apply kind of in a non-union setting? you know, where conflict isn't sort of built into sort of the relationship between the employer and workers. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to have to think about it. But I think
it was an unfair question.
It was a broad one, but it's okay. We can talk about it sort of separately if you'd like
Absolutely.
to.
Great. So we have about 4 more minutes left, so maybe time for one more question, maybe from the audience. If not, we can go to Amanda's question to Kevin.
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
This is for Kevin, and it's have you encountered the nonprofit theory of intentional government failure? I think it's from Avner Benner.
Oh no, I don't. I've never encountered it. Yeah.
So the theory behind that is, in addition to the budgetary responses, the government as a first mover in a strategic game may intentionally choose to underproduce some of the public good because they can rely on the nonprofit sector responding to the government sector. You then can add to this not just public goods, but quasi-public goods that are intentionally left for subpopulations. And one implication of that is that it's not just a matter of budgetary restrictions that creates the incentive for this nonprofit sector, but it could be the fact that the government is saying, we recognize that we don't have a comparative advantage in serving this population. So even if we expand our budget, we're just going to continue to fund the same things that we've always done. And we're going to leave the comparative advantage to the nonprofit sector because they have some information to serve that population that we don't have and that we don't trust our ability to do so. So that wouldn't change your results, but it may change the interpretation rather than it being skimming or creaming as a response to other nonprofits and in response to their stakeholders. Also considering that they're responding to what the government may be responding to, not just from a budgetary standpoint, but from them sticking their claims to not cover certain public goods.
Thank you. That's brilliant. I appreciate it.
The guy's name is Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to. I'll put my email in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I know of him. My previous advisor when I was a master's student at Chicago worked with him, Jennifer Mosley. But that's brilliant. Thank you.
Great. We have about 1.5 minutes left. Does anyone want to have any closing remarks or questions? Okay, well, I guess we can end it about a minute early then. I want to give a round of applause to our presenters.
I can ask my question if you want.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Why not?
Okay, cool. Also, Kevin, I second the vouching for Avner. He's great. So Kevin, it seemed like part of your hypothesis was about how this creaming might be because of accountability, like creaming because these nonprofit organizations have these like they want to potentially appear successful. They have to like show these metrics to stakeholders in order to show that they're getting the job done. And I'm wondering if there's any way for you to look at, you know, the places that might be, the organizations that might be under more scrutiny or under greater accountability or have to produce metrics, if they are more likely to cream than those who are kind of given more free rein to further their mission as opposed to say like produce something for their donors.
Yeah, I love the question. I think it's a very challenging question that I will be hand wavy about. I think that it's difficult, right, to kind of quantify scrutiny and to quantify like how compounded the funding requirements are, because nonprofits in general have tons of funding sources, and in each funding source, the metrics that are used even to measure, you know, workforce development or mainstream workforce development differ widely in terms of what foundations, you know, stakeholders, banks want to know. And so it's really difficult to figure out it's difficult to quantify like how much capacity that drains. It's also like mediated by organizational leadership, and that leads to like the performance management kind of literature, right? The performance management kind of literature where leaders with more long-term visions for how data should be used and collected can facilitate organizational learning, decoupling, and you know, allowing nonprofits to do more of their own thing. But but I think it's a fantastic question that I need to keep thinking about for sure.
Great. And with that, I guess we'll end it. Thank you everyone so much for attending. Happy LERA virtual conference, and great job presenters. I appreciate it. It was a pleasure to be your chair. And hopefully we'll see each other in person next year.